Have you ever felt that inexplicable weight in your chest, as if life had lost its color? You wake up, do what needs to be done, but everything feels automatic, as if you were trapped in a meaningless cycle. It's not just the exhausting routine, but a deeper kind of weariness, as if somehow you were disconnected from yourself. The days pass, and nothing seems to change. You find yourself thinking, is this really my place? Am I living the right way? Maybe, without realizing it, you're trying to fill a void you don't even know the origin of. This kind of exhaustion is not just physical or mental, but existential. No matter how many hours of sleep you get or how many distractions you seek, nothing seems enough to relieve this feeling of being out of place. And the more you try to find an answer, the further it seems to be. It feels like we are always chasing something: success, recognition, happiness. But when we finally achieve it, we realize that something is still missing. Then, we start the search again, and the cycle repeats itself. But what if the problem isn't life itself? What if we're looking in the wrong place? Carl Jung, one of the greatest thinkers in psychology, believed that this feeling of emptiness and disorientation is not a flaw, but a sign. To him, moments of crisis like these are invitations to look within, because many times we are living a life that is not truly ours, but rather the one expected of us. From a young age, we learn to fit in. We are taught what we should do, how we should act, what we should believe in. We create an identity based on external expectations, but something inside us senses that something is wrong, as if there were a silent voice trying to tell us that we are living in a way that does not align with our true nature. This conflict between who we truly are and who we think we should be generates profound exhaustion. We try to fit in, follow society's script, but deep down, we feel that something essential is missing. The problem is that instead of stopping to listen to this unrest, we do the opposite. We seek distractions, immerse ourselves in work, consume content that numbs us, all to avoid facing this uncomfortable truth. Maybe we are betraying ourselves. But Jung teaches us that this crisis, as painful as it may be, can be an opportunity. What we perceive as exhaustion and frustration may actually be a call from our own soul, urging us to change direction. But understanding this is only the first step. What comes next requires courage. The truth is that most of us spend much of our lives trying to escape this call. Whenever we feel this anguish, we look for something to distract us from it: social media, excessive work, superficial relationships, anything that keeps us from being alone with our own thoughts. But Jung warned that no matter how much we try to silence this inner voice, it never truly disappears. On the contrary, the more we ignore it, the stronger it becomes. Until one day, something happens: an emotional breakdown, a moment of loss, a crisis so intense that it forces us to stop and face what is inside us. Jung called this process individuation, the path that leads each of us to become who we truly are. He believed that, to achieve this, we need to look within and recognize all parts of ourselves, including those we reject or deny. He said that within each person exists an unknown self, a hidden part we were taught to ignore. This hidden side of ourselves is what he called the shadow, and it is precisely this shadow that holds the answers to our exhaustion and frustration. The shadow is made up of everything we have learned to hide: repressed desires, unexpressed emotions, traumas we pretend don't exist. Since childhood, we hear that certain attitudes and feelings are not acceptable. So instead of facing them, we push them deep into our minds, as if we could simply erase them. But they do not disappear. On the contrary, they continue to influence our actions, our fears, our insecurities. Whenever we feel that something inside us is fragmented, it is because we are fighting against our own shadow. And what Jung teaches us is that we cannot run from it forever. Sooner or later, this denied part of ourselves manifests in dreams, in emotional outbursts, in destructive patterns we repeat without understanding why. Jung said that the shadow is not something inherently bad, but rather an essential part of our psyche. And instead of rejecting it, we need to integrate it. Because as long as we run from it, we remain trapped in a cycle of frustration and self-sabotage. The problem is that facing the shadow requires a different kind of courage. It means admitting that we are not always who we would like to be. That within us, there are contradictions, impulses we don't understand, pains we avoid. And that can be terrifying. But Jung believed that it is precisely by facing this hidden part of ourselves that we find true meaning in life. Because only when we stop running from ourselves can we finally begin to truly understand who we are. And this is where the big question arises. Are we willing to look within? Or will we continue searching for answers on the outside without realizing that what we truly seek has always been inside us? Most of us prefer to avoid this inner journey because we have been conditioned to believe that looking within is dangerous. We were taught that questioning too much could lead to suffering, that certain emotions should be ignored, that we should adapt and move forward without thinking too much. But Jung warns us, ignoring our own truth can be far more painful than facing it. Because when we live in denial, our own psyche finds ways to alert us that something is wrong, whether through anxiety, depression, or a constant sense of dissatisfaction. The shadow we ignore begins to manifest in subtle ways. It appears in relationships when we project our fears and insecurities onto others. It appears in the wrong choices we keep repeating, as if we were destined to fall into the same traps. And the most curious thing? The more we deny this hidden side, the more it takes control of our lives without us realizing it. It's as if we are being guided by an invisible script, written by everything we didn't have the courage to face. Jung said that the shadow is not only formed by our fears and traumas, but also by potentialities we have never explored. Often the person we want to become is hidden within this repressed part of ourselves. That confidence we envy in others, that creativity we believe we don't have, that strength we doubt exists within us. All of this may be buried in the shadow, waiting to be reclaimed. But to do so, we must first recognize and integrate it. And how do we do that? First, by stopping the escape. Instead of filling every moment of the day with distractions, we need to create space for silence, for introspection, observing our own patterns without judgment. When a strong emotion arises, whether anger, envy, insecurity, instead of repressing it, we should ask, what is this trying to show me about myself? Because every time we overreact to something, it is a sign that the shadow is trying to express itself. Another path Jung pointed to was the exploration of dreams. He believed that dreams are messages from the unconscious, symbols that can help us understand what is hidden. Often what we avoid confronting in our waking life appears in our dreams in enigmatic forms, like unknown figures, strange scenarios, repetitive situations. Paying attention to these symbols can be a way to connect with parts of ourselves that we have not yet understood. But perhaps Jung's most important lesson is this: the shadow is not an enemy. It is not something we must eliminate or fight against. On the contrary, it is part of who we are. And only when we learn to accept it, to listen to it, and to work with it, can we find real balance. True transformation does not come from perfection, but from acceptance. Because being whole does not mean being only light, it means integrating the darkness as well. The idea of integrating the shadow may seem abstract, but in practice, it means becoming more authentic. When we don't recognize our internal contradictions, we end up living a life shaped by external expectations, carrying an invisible weight of masks and personas that do not represent who we truly are. And this wears us down, drains us. The exhaustion of life often does not come only from routine or responsibilities, but from the distance between who we are and who we pretend to be. Jung believed that much of our suffering comes from this internal disconnection. At some point, we convinced ourselves that we would only be accepted if we lived up to an ideal, if we were successful, if we appeared happy all the time. But the more we try to fit into this mold, the emptier we feel. Because the soul cannot stand being ignored. Whenever we betray our own essence, it gives us signs, whether in the form of anguish, dissatisfaction, or that feeling of living on autopilot. And this is the crucial point. As long as we see existential discomfort only as a problem to be solved, we will not understand the message it carries. Jung invites us to change our perspective. Instead of seeing this exhaustion as a burden, we should see it as a sign that something within us needs to be transformed. It is not about eliminating suffering, but understanding what it is trying to teach us. And this leads us to another fundamental concept in Jungian psychology, the self, or the true self. For Jung, the ego, this identity we construct for the world, is only a part of our psyche, but it is not our whole being. The ego is concerned with status, image, recognition. It wants to be accepted, to avoid pain, to ensure that we are following the right path. But the self does not care about that. It represents the totality of who we are, including both light and shadow. And the journey of individuation, this process of becoming who we truly are, involves balancing these two sides. But this balance requires courage, because it means letting go of certain certainties, detaching from an identity that may have been built to please others. It means allowing ourselves to be imperfect, accepting that we won't always have all the answers and that many times we will fail. But Jung reminds us that it is precisely in this space of vulnerability that true transformation happens. When we stop pretending to be only what we show to the world, we begin to access an inner strength that has always been there, but that we had ignored. This is the most challenging part of the journey, trusting the unknown within us. Jung said that the realization of the self is not a final destination, but a continuous process, and that genuine happiness does not come from achieving an idealized version of ourselves, but from accepting the complexity of our own existence. So, the big question is, are we willing to take this step? Or will we continue living trapped in the same stories, avoiding what could actually set us free? The great challenge of this process is that it requires a direct confrontation with everything we have avoided throughout life. The shadow, this hidden side of the psyche, does not dissolve just because we become aware of it. On the contrary, by recognizing it, we realize how much it has been present in our choices, influencing our fears, our relationships, and even our dreams. And at this moment, an uncomfortable realization arises. The awareness that much of what we believed ourselves to be may have been nothing more than a character created to survive in a world that taught us to repress our true nature. Jung said that individuation, the path to authenticity, is not a peaceful journey. He described this process as a true encounter with the unknown within us. The psyche does not transform through rational effort or superficial attempts at self-improvement. It is not about thinking positively or simply repeating motivational mantras. True change happens when we allow ourselves to feel, when we dive into discomfort without trying to escape it. Because it is in the confrontation with our deepest emotions that we discover who we truly are. And this brings us to another essential concept in Jungian psychology: archetypes. Jung believed that within the collective unconscious, there are universal patterns that shape our experiences and behaviors. One of these archetypes is the hero, that part of us that seeks to grow, overcome challenges, and find a greater purpose. But before becoming the true hero of our own story, each of us must face another archetype, the shadow. This means dealing with our fears, insecurities, and the aspects of our personality that we would rather ignore. And here's a crucial point. The shadow is not just a repository of traumas and negative aspects. Many times it contains dormant potential, talents we have repressed out of fear of judgment, passions we have buried because they did not fit into what was expected of us. Jung said that integrating the shadow does not mean merely recognizing our flaws, but also reclaiming valuable parts of ourselves that we left behind, perhaps the boldness we once had and lost, the creativity we suppressed to be practical, the spontaneity that was replaced by a constant sense of duty. This recovery can be painful because it means letting go of old certainties. It means realizing that many of the truths we believed in were imposed, that our insecurities were learned, that our fears were inherited from a world that taught us to doubt our own capabilities. And once we realize this, a new question arises. What do we do now? Because once we see the shadow, we can no longer pretend it does not exist. What remains is to decide whether we will continue denying who we are or if we will finally have the courage to become whole. And this is where the true journey begins. Because integrating the shadow does not just mean understanding it intellectually, but acting from this new understanding. It means changing patterns, challenging limiting beliefs, abandoning old roles that no longer make sense. And often, this means leaving behind what was once comfortable but no longer represents us. Because in the end, the price of becoming who we truly are is letting go of who others expect us to be. The great question Jung leaves us with is this: now that we see our shadow, what will we do with it? Because understanding is only the first step. Real transformation happens when this awareness translates into action. But taking action often means breaking patterns that have accompanied us our entire lives. And that can be terrifying because it implies losing a part of what we believed ourselves to be. The truth is, not everyone is ready for this journey. Many prefer to cling to the familiarity of what they already know, even if it means living dissatisfied. But for those who feel there is no turning back, who have already seen too much to keep pretending, there is a path. And it begins with a simple movement: being present. Jung said that consciousness is born the moment we stop living on autopilot and start observing our own thoughts and emotions without judgment. This means stepping out of the blind repetition of habits and beliefs and asking, is this choice truly mine, or was it imposed by society, by family, by the fear of not being accepted? The more we ask these questions, the more we discover that much of what defined us was merely a reflection of what was expected of us. And then, a second challenge arises. By abandoning these artificial identities, we may feel an emptiness. After all, who are we without the roles we play? Without the need to please, without the endless search for validation, without the obligation to be something that does not align with our essence. This uncertainty can be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating, because it is in this empty space that the possibility of being authentic emerges. But how do we live this authenticity in practice? Jung believed that the answer lay in the connection with the self, the center of our psyche, which guides us toward a life more aligned with who we truly are. He said that when we live according to the self, and not just according to the ego, our choices are no longer driven by fear or the need for acceptance. Instead, we begin to act more spontaneously, more intuitively, more aligned with our true purpose. And the most fascinating thing? When we start living this way, many of the pains we carry begin to lose their power. Because much of our suffering does not come from life itself, but from resisting who we are. Anxiety diminishes when we stop trying to control the uncontrollable. Sadness dissolves when we accept that we do not need to fit into a mold. Existential exhaustion transforms into curiosity when we understand that life is not a burden, but a journey of self-discovery. In the end, Jung teaches us that peace does not come from having all the answers, but from being comfortable with the questions. It is not about eliminating fear, but about not letting it paralyze us. It is not about creating a perfect self, but about accepting that being human means being imperfect, contradictory, and, at the same time, infinite in potential. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson of all. When we stop hiding from ourselves, we discover that life was never against us. We were just looking at it with the wrong eyes. If this message resonated with you, if at any moment in this video you felt that these words touched something inside you, then this is the sign that your journey of self-knowledge has already begun. Transformation does not happen all at once, but with every small choice we make to live more authentically. And if you want to keep exploring topics like this, to understand more about Jungian psychology and personal development, then go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Leave a like, as it helps this content reach more people who, just like you, may be in need of this message. And of course, share it with someone who could also benefit from this knowledge. The journey to becoming who we truly are can be challenging, but you don't have to walk it alone. So, let's move forward together in this search for a more conscious and authentic life. See you in the next video.